The scholarly practice of interpreting the Qur'an, known as Tafsīr, has often been criticized for introducing misogyny into the way Muslims understand the Holy Scripture. Scholars working within secular academia have often labeled traditional Quranic exegeses as consistently patriarchal, misogynistic, and dismissive of the perspectives of women. Nevertheless, a significant portion of research on women in the Quran tends to avoid delving deeply into tafsir as an academic discipline. This reluctance often arises from preconceived notions that the exegetical tradition is inherently rooted in patriarchal beliefs and is incapable of providing interpretations of the Quran that promote equality. However, in her groundbreaking work, Rebellious Wives, Neglectful Husbands, Controversies in Modern Quranic Commentaries, Dr. Hadia Mubarak argues that dismissing Quranic commentaries as inherently sexist from the outset causes us to miss the significant interventions made within this genre that challenge and undermine the misogynistic interpretations of the Quran. Dr. Hadia Mubarak is an assistant professor of religion at Queen's University of Charlotte. Dr. Mubarak completed a PhD in Islamic Studies from Georgetown University, where she specialized in modern and classical Quranic exegeses, Islamic feminism, and gender reform in the modern Muslim world. In this book, she conducts a thorough examination of the range of interpretations provided by both pre-modern and modern scholars regarding contentious gender-related topics, including polygamy, marital rights, marital conflicts, the handling of rebellious wives, and so on. In a more specific context, this book places three of the most influential Sunni Quranic commentaries from the 20th century at the intersection of historical and intellectual encounters that have a significant impact on gender-oriented interpretations of the Quran. The first of these commentaries is Tafsīr al-Manār, co-authored by Muhammad Abdu and Rashid Rida, recognized as the earliest modernist approach to Quranic interpretation. The second commentary, Fi Zilāl al-Qur'an by Sayyid Qutb, was partially composed during his imprisonment in Egypt and is known as one of the most widely translated and disseminated Islamic books in history. The third commentary, al-Tahrīr wal-Tanbīr by Muhammad al-Tahir ibn Ashur, represents a revival of the philological tradition in modern exegesis and is considered one of the most methodologically rigorous commentaries of the 20th century. By contextualizing these modern commentaries within the broader genre of tafsir, the book compares the interpretations of Abdu, Rida, Qutb, and Ibn Ashur with 7 pre-modern commentaries spanning from the 9th to the 14th centuries, focusing on verses dealing with issues related to neglectful husbands, rebellious wives, polygyny, and marital hierarchy. These verses have been central to contentious debates over the past several decades regarding the Quran's potential to promote gender justice. In this episode, Dr. Mubarak talks to us about her detailed textual analysis of the modern changes in Quranic exegesis concerning controversial gender-related verses and the influence of modernity and its associated discourses on how Muslim scholars engage with the topic of women in the Quran.
Welcome to Ergo Collective's podcast, Dariyaa. You're diving board into the deep end of politics, culture, society, and policy. We explore the ideas and events shaping our world, from local happenings to global shifts, unpacking social movements and diving into cultural traditions. But we are not just here to scratch an intellectual itch. We believe bridging the gap between academic insight and public discourse is crucial for an informed and engaged citizenry. With social anthropology, historiography, critical theory, and political philosophy as our trusty sidekicks, we come with a promise to make these powerful frameworks accessible and relatable. So buckle up and join us as we go beyond the surface level, putting ideas into context, unpacking complex issues, and unveiling the hidden structure shaping our lives. Hello, Dr. Mubarak. Welcome to Huff Podcast. In today's conversation, we'll try to draw upon your scholarship to understand how the exegetical tradition, the exegesis of the Quran, that is, has engaged with women within the discursive tradition of Islam. But before we get into that discussion, let us just first begin with you telling us a bit about your intellectual journey and what got you interested in exploring questions related to Islam, women, and gender studies.
Yeah, thank you, Sania, and I'm excited to share my research with your audience today. So, when I was growing up, I grew up in Panama City, Florida, which is the South. It's basically the Bible Belt, which, worked well for my parents because they wanted my sister. At that time, it was just my sister and me. We were really young. They wanted us to grow up in an environment that was more maybe socially conservative, you can say. And so the Bible Belt was like the perfect place for them to move. And, there's a lot of obviously commonalities, that we share with our Christian brothers and sisters. And anyway, so in high school, I got involved in, it was Rutherford High School. I got involved in the newspaper. And I quickly became the editor-in-chief of my newspaper for 2 years, the high school newspaper, which, I didn't even know that I had a talent for writing, I guess you can say. Back then, I mean, I feel like my creative writing isn't as strong, once you go into academia, it kills your creative writing. And then anyway, so then when I went to college, I really wanted to do journalism and become a journalist, but Florida State University did not have a journalism program. So I joined my college newspaper, and I was writing articles, and I eventually moved up to become assistant news editor of the FSVU and Florida Flambeau. But while I was in college, my second year, 9/11 happened. And I was by coincidence the spokesperson of the Muslim Students Association at that time. And also, not just because of the position I held as an officer of the MSA, but I also, just as a Muslim American, I had a really, really difficult time reconciling 9/11. I think like a lot of Muslims, it was this question of, how could 19 men who shared my faith inflict so much horror and violence on the rest of the world, especially when, for me, Islam had always been a source of refuge, of like closeness to God, of spirituality, of purpose in life. And I just couldn't reconcile in my mind how someone could use it as a weapon, right, to inflict violence. And so it led to a lot of questions. And also, my professors, to their credit, gave me a lot of opportunities to speak to others, to my classes. I was invited to speak to churches, to schools for the first time in my life, really. And all this happened when I was an undergrad. So that really set me on a trajectory, I think, to think about Islam more on an academic level. And so at the time, I didn't know what I was going to be doing with my life, but I decided to do a master's in contemporary Arab studies. And I thought I would focus on the politics of the Middle East. Instead, I ended up really developing a passion for questions of women and gender in the Arab world. And then that led me to a PhD in Islamic studies, where I really focused on women and gender in Tafsīr, which are Quranic commentaries.
Thank you. That's very interesting. So let's just move into a discussion about your book now, Rebellious Wives, Neglectful Husbands. So could you begin by telling us a bit about the onset of modernity and how that brought about a shift, or how that influenced the way the tradition of tafsir engaged with women?
Certainly. So, modernity in many ways produced ruptures in the Muslim world, and especially intellectual ruptures. I think a lot of times we are unaware of how radically transformed the role of religious ulama, religious scholars, religious seminaries, and really their autonomy from the state, how much all of that was disrupted by modernity. And it really shifted things. And what you had with the creation of modern nation states was the creation of new forms of identity, new forms of legislation. It really marginalized the role of your religious scholars. It took the financial endowments that used to belong under the purview of the religious scholars, now became under the state, right? Under this new ministry of waqf, they call it, or ministry of awqaf. And also, obviously, this is not an area I really look at closely, but a lot of other scholars have looked at this, the role of modern education and modern schools, and the way modern education was really a vehicle through which to disseminate and promote this new national identity, and a lot of this modernist project that, frankly, colonialism sort of, bequeathed to the Muslim world. And I look at it from a discursive perspective, right? What new discourses, specifically on women and gender in Islam, did this precipitate? And what we find is colonialists really found Islam to be a major obstacle for women's progress. And it's really bizarre in many ways. And some historians like Layla Ahmed have pointed out just how really, I don't think she uses the word hypocritical, but I guess you can use a kinder word like inconsistent. a lot of their policies were, because in their own home countries, these men were not feminists by any means, and yet they used or appropriated the language of feminism to sort of morally legitimate the colonial project. And it was like, okay, we're not just here to assert, authority and, benefit from the natural resources of this place. We're here to save women, right? And this rhetoric of saving women is really, really interesting, because we continue to see it today, right? Like even in the 21st century, at the eve of the United States entering Afghanistan, we heard this rhetoric all over again, like we're there to save women. And I just thought I would point that out to your audience. And so, one of those colonial administrators was Lord Cromer, the British consul, who effectively ruled Egypt for almost a decade. For more than a decade in Egypt, up until 1907, right? And so I want to point out, he was ruling at the time that Muhammad Abdo was this really influential Islamic modernist, was writing, and he was writing he didn't actually write his exegesis, but his commentary was delivered in the form of sermons that later his disciple transcribed, Rashid Rida. But the point being is that there were new discourses surrounding this question of women in Islam that created made this topic a very, one that was loaded with not just, ideological implications, but one can frankly say, political implications, because became this question that if Islam oppresses women, should we allow Islam to have any role in this, in the governance of this new state? Should Islam have any role in the forms of legislation that these new states would rely on? And so I look at 4 exegetes, and they're all in North Africa. And so I'm really focusing on the rhetoric of colonialism in North Africa. And even though one of the exegetes is in Tunisia, we find that the French in Algeria use very similar type of discourses. And there was almost this like obsession with focusing on women, female sexuality, the veil, seclusion, right, polygyny. These were sort of seen as like major obstacles. And it's really interesting, I think, to think about gendered Orientalism, because really gendered Orientalism is going all the way back to this colonial period, where this idea that Muslims are essentially different, right, than the West, or even antithetical, that Muslim values are antithetical to Western values. The measure of that becomes women. Look at how they treat their women, right? And it's so interesting, because we continue to see resonances of this even in modern pop culture today in the West.
If you enjoy our podcast and want to support our mission, consider buying us a coffee. Help us by covering our running costs. Your contribution, no matter how small, help us continue produce high-quality content and bring academic insights to a wider audience. Just head over to Buy Me a Coffee page and show us your support. Every little bit makes a difference, and we truly appreciate your generosity. Link is in the podcast description.
Yeah, so when it comes to Tafsīr, I think this genre of Quranic exegesis is considered to be very patriarchal and misogynistic, at least in the secular discourse. But as you have shown us in this book, it is also, there is a plurality within it, right? So my question to you is that could you elaborate upon this a little bit and tell our audience as to how you have dealt with this in your book, and how you have tried to show the inherent plurality of the exegetical tradition through your research?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. I think what I note from the beginning is that there are a lot of very, I guess, dynamic scholarly debate within the field of Islamic studies in the West as to whether or not the Quran is inherently patriarchal or inherently egalitarian, right? So you've had, with the rise of Islamic feminism, and some of these scholars don't necessarily identify as feminists or Islamic feminists, but you've had this new wave of scholarship really since the 1990s that at least are, even if they don't identify as Islamic feminists, are at least Islamic feminists in their methodology and in really disrupting this notion that the Quran is patriarchal, right? So you have works like Asma Barlas's book, Believing Women, Unreading Patriarchal Interpretations of the Quran. You have Amina Wadood's really important book, Quran and Women. You have even more recent ones, Abdullah Hassan, Decoding the Quran, Gender Egalitarianism. Asma Lambrabat, I believe is how you pronounce her last name. She's from Morocco, has also written a book about women speaking in the Quran. So obviously, Celine Ibrahim, I should mention, has written Women and Gender in the Quran. And, they're specifically with Celine Ibrahim, she's not necessarily engaging with this question of the Quran, gender egalitarianism, or misogyny. But this has been an ongoing debate. And so you've had, while these scholars I just mentioned, as well as, Maryam Farouqi, Aziz al-Hibri, have really demonstrated that the Quran is in itself an egalitarian text, and that misogyny has really been imposed by centuries of misinterpretation. You've had another kind of, I guess you can say, block of scholars who've contested that claim and who've said, well, that's, disingenuous, or, you're using the sort of interpretive acrobatics to arrive to that, to that conclusion. And one thing I know in the book is that, despite the great merits of a lot of those works, they're not really engaging with tafsir. And so in a lot of these works, tafsir as a body of literature that has really Muslims have bequeathed from centuries of scholarship, doesn't really get engaged and is sort of dismissed as a priori misogynistic. And so therefore, why engage it, right? If all this exegesis is just going to is monolithically patriarchal, why engage it at all? And what I find is that that's actually not an accurate depiction at all. One thing I really try to do in this book is I try to place as much as possible these works in their historical context. And once you place them in their historical context and you ask questions like, with whom were they engaging? Who were these exegetes engaging with? Because one of the main arguments of this book is that Quranic interpretation does not happen in a vacuum. It happens, there's this dialectic that's happening between the author of the commentary and other contemporaneous debates. So for the modern exegetes that I'm examining, right, Muhammad Abdo, Rashid Rida, Sayyid Qutb, and Muhammad al-Tahir ibn Ashur, especially when it comes to women and gender in the Quran, they're clearly engaging with certain contemporaneous debates that are happening around them. And they're not necessarily all responding to the same audience. They're responding to different audiences, which I point out. And you can only arrive at that conclusion or finding if you are really situating those texts in their historical context. But it's the same thing with medieval exegetes, right? So just to give you an example, a really famous, and well-known exegete is Fakhruddin al-Razi, who dies 1209, and he was like a heavyweight. Sometimes you find that he's repeating certain things that al-Zamakhshari said about women, and some things that are not very nice, in my opinion, about women, right? Like this idea that in verse 4, 128, this idea that woman's nature or spirit is naturally inclined or desiring of men. And that is why in this Quranic verse, God tells the women to وَلْيَتَرَبَّصْنَ بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ, that they have to not just wait, but like literally hold back themselves, right? بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ. And it's this whole like elaboration, like, well, why is this word or this phrase بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ there? And while women's spirits are desirous of men and they naturally want men. And some of this gets I guess they get carried away with this idea in some of these other verses as well, like with, I think it was Ibn Kathir, who says that it's because women were made of men, from, the original woman was made from man. And that is why, women need to, women incline towards men, and this is why they need to stay home, right? So like something to that degree. But my point being is, so al-Razi is repeating az-Zamakhshari's tafsir because he is engaging with his tafsir for a very specific reason. He wants to build on his philological gems, right, and linguistic kind of insights, while also discrediting his Mu'tazili leanings and sort of asserting al-Razi's tafsir as like the new tafsir of this field. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that al-Razi really believed this about women, right? So my point is these are complex people and they're complex texts. And what I think as female scholars, and not just female scholars, really just Muslim scholars, looking at this question of what does the Quran really say? What did God really mean? What's divine intent, right? It's really important that we dive into this really deep, rich literature of Quranic exegesis, because we find complexities, we find nuances, and in fact, we even find some egalitarianism. And I'm not saying that, I do say that there is a patriarchal bent overall, but it's not all patriarchal, and there is some important pushback. And that's where I try to identify both among the medieval commentaries and the modern commentaries, where there is pushback against dominant interpretations. And again, my argument, I'm sorry if I'm kind of jumping ahead, but my argument is that if medieval and modern exegetes could challenge the dominant interpretation of a specific passage or word within a passage, and they could do so while also having interpretive authority and also being kind of accepted within the mainstream Muslim community, then what's to keep Muslim scholars from doing that today, right? If there is a legitimate, I think, methodology that we're, and I think that's the key thing, right? It's not just about like projecting our contemporary sensibilities upon a text that, of course, Muslims believe is universal, but at the same time was Muslims believe was revealed to Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century. So it's not just about projecting our sensibilities upon the Quran, but about really engaging with this text and yes, bringing new insights to bear upon this text. This is something that Muslims have done for centuries, and it's been okay.
Yeah. So you've chosen the commentaries of three modern scholars for this book of Muhammad Abdu, Rashid Rida, and Ibn Ashur. So could you introduce them to our listeners and talk a little about their religious-political thought, their methodology, the methodology that they adopted for Quranic interpretation, and also tell us a little about why you chose these three particular scholars for this book.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, just to clarify, so I look at three commentaries, but one of them is co-authored. So four commentators. So the first one is Tafsīr al-Manār. Tafsīr al-Manār was written by co-authored, you can say, by both Muhammad Abdu and Rashid Rida. It was first published in 1905. And that tafsir was, and so, sorry, just to quickly, before I get into the details, the second commentary I look at is by Sayyid Qutb, fi Zilāl al-Qur'an, and he passed away in 1966. And then the third commentary is al-Tahrīr wa-Tanwīr by Muhammad al-Tahrīr ibn Ashur, who dies, I believe, 1973. So first, I'll begin with Tafsīr al-Manār, and then I'll try to explain why these specific commentaries, right? This is the first commentary to take an Islamic modernist approach to tafsir. Abdu was really unique. And again, it's co-authored by both. It's important to recognize that Muhammad Abdu, however, passes away in the middle of Rida transcribing this tafsir. So we only have Abdu's commentary up till verse 125, I believe. And then, in fact, the entire tafsir only gets up till chapter, I believe, chapter 12 of the Quran. So Abdu really tried to avoid sort of the philological, theological, and juristic arguments that many of the medieval Quranic commentaries delved into. And he really wanted to revive the relevance of the Quran to modern societies. And so in many ways, what you find is sort of new issues being brought to bear, right? So whether it's politics or women and gender or scientific discoveries or, even historical or philosophical arguments being made contemporaneously, right? So you have in this tafsir, for example, like Western scholars, Western European scholars being quoted, which is something you wouldn't have seen in, pre-modern commentaries. And so it was really this idea that we want to make the Quran relevant to societies at that time. And one of the goals of Tafsīr al-Manār was to make the Quran accessible to every reader, at least to make the tafsir accessible. So especially with Abdu, you can see that he really avoids a lot of like deeply intricate academic issues, right? And it tends to be written in a way that's really speaking to the average layperson, not to other academics, which is interesting because pre-modern exegetes were not writing for a lay audience. They were writing for other specialists, right? And when I get to Ibn Ashur, I will talk about how Ibn Ashur tries to revive that objective of tafsir. That this is really supposed to be a scholarly pursuit. And so Sayyid Qutb is also his tafsir is fi Zilāl al-Qur'an. It's also unique. So his ideological orientation is he becomes an Islamist at a certain point of his life. He actually begins his career as a literary critic, a secular literary critic. So in fact, in his book, al-Taswīr al-Fanni fi al-Qur'an, it's not written from a religious, quote unquote, religious perspective. But because he was a literary critic, he had a lot of unique insights to bring to the Quran in terms of its, the musical harmony of certain chapters of the Quran, the internal rhythm, the coherence, the thematic approach. So he does bring, from a methodological perspective, some very new approaches to reading the Quran. And I would even argue, his commentary is actually, according to Johannes Janssen, the most widely translated commentary in the modern period. And without doubt, it's very, very popular. Today, if you wanted in English an entire commentary from beginning to end, this is one of the few that you'll find that's been translated, right? From beginning to end. Entire 30, or however, like all 30 chapters, ajza within the Quran are translated. And so, what I want to say actually is I believe that the reason for his popularity is not just because, the Nasser regime made a martyr of him of sorts, if you will, by executing him in 1966, but rather he really does bring this unique linguistic approach to the Quran. And I think in a lot of scholarship on Sayyid Qutb, that is overlooked. I think this, this training he had as a literary critic is just really overlooked. And that is what makes his commentary, in my opinion, special to a lot of people. It's not really this ideological prism, but nonetheless, clearly also, by the way, this Quran was written this tafsir, his tafsir was written during this intermittent, I think 12-year period. And some of the years in which he was writing, he was in prison. And so you can discern this ideological shift happening. In fact, even with his book, Ma'alim fi al-Tariq, Milestones, William Shepard, a political scientist, looked at 6 different editions of that book. And with each edition, you can see what he calls, I don't know if he calls it like a gradual radicalization, but maybe a gradual form of like rigidness, dogmatic rigidness that happens over time. And I think it's important for us, to look at these individuals' lives, right? And what was going on in their lives, and to note, like, he was in prison, he was probably being tortured in prison. And yes, these kinds of circumstances will have an influence and bear some influence on your political thought and ideological thought. And we do see that, right? And so his hermeneutic, though, was unique in the sense of trying to understand with each chapter what was its axis, right? He said every chapter revolved around this axis. Again, there's this like textual coherence and musical rhythm. And in my opinion, despite the fact that he does have these really important literary contributions he makes, I do think the ideology, especially towards the very end of his life, this notion of jahiliyyah and hakmiyah, it ends up sort of, to some extent, becoming a limitation within his tafsir, because he tries to then interpret many of the Quran's verses through this lens, right? Of like, we live in a jahili world. We live in a world where people are not really Muslim. They're basically ignorant and similar to the ignorance of pre-Islamic Arabia. And sorry, I know I've been really kind of long-winded. I'll just get to the last commentary I examined, which is Muhammad al-Tahrīr ibn Ashur's al-Tahrīr wa tanwīr, translated as verification and enlightenment. So I think one thing we need to know is this is coming towards the later end of the 20th century. I think it's first published in 1971, at least a certain some parts of it. And a lot has happened within the discipline of tafsir, of Quranic exegesis, from when Abdo first started with this sort of new approach in 1905 to the time that Ibn Ashur was writing really in the 1960s and 1970s. And so in many ways, he is trying to now revive the classical tradition in certain ways, specifically in methodology, because at this time there have been, I noted that back in 1905, Abdul's tafsir was the first modernist approach. Well, there had been many other after him that had tried similar things. There had been other projects of trying to, interpret the Quran through the lens of science, through the lens of history, through the lens of textual criticism. And so Ibn Ashur really wants to revive the classical philological approach to Quran, that first of all, it's language that is the primary arbiter of meaning, right? Not history, not science, not even hadith or al-Ma'thur. I'll talk about what al-Ma'thur is. So also at this time, within Quranic studies, there was this emergence of a camp that believed there is these two sort of dichotomous approaches to interpretation. One is tafsir bil-ra'i, which can be loosely translated as, exegesis by reasoning. And then this notion that there's tafsir bil-ma'thur, which is, again, loosely translated as exegesis by, authentic reports, let's call them, right? And these authentic reports oftentimes are dating back to the first generations of Islam, but not necessarily going back to the Prophet, peace be upon him, himself, nor necessarily going to even some of his close companions, right? A lot of them are coming from the generation of what we call the tabi'in, the successors, or even their followers. And so in the 20th century, there ends up becoming a gradual idea that like real tafsir needs to be tafsir bil-ma'thur, needs to be this exegesis that's really based on these authentic reports. Ibn Ashur, interestingly, really pushes back against this idea, and he tries to untangle what tafsir bil-ra'i is. And he says, do you really think that when we say, I'm trying to think of some names like al-Qatada or Muqatil ibn Sulaiman, or these well-known exegetes who a lot of this like early corpus comes from, do you really think, he says, that they were giving an interpretation that wasn't based on their own reasoning? And he tries to disrupt this dichotomy by saying that tafsir bil-ma'thur is in many ways tafsir bil-ra'i, and it's not just this like, oh, this is what I think. He says tafsir bil-ra'i at the end of the day is based on concrete knowledge, but it acknowledges that there is this process of human interpretation that's happening in both scenarios, because, and he makes this really interesting point, and he also quotes al-Ghazali, Abu Hamid ibn al-Ghazali for this. And he says, that had this companion or even this tabi'i scholar been given, if they gave this interpretation based on a prophetic interpretation, then they would have said so, right? Like his whole argument is like, they would have said that the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, quote unquote, and whatever that interpretation was. But he says they don't say that. And so clearly it is an interpretation they are giving based on their best efforts to really sort of synthesize all the knowledge that they had. And he argues that modern scholars who have the legitimate qualifications have the ability to do so in the 21st century as well, or 20th century. And but what are those primary qualifications, right? And he argues that those primary qualifications are, at the end of the day, linguistic ones, right? And he talks about like 5 different disciplines of language that need to be really mastered in order to do tafsir: lexicology, morphology, grammar, and then semantics and figures of speech, ilm al-ma'ani and ilm al-bayan, which are kind of divisions of rhetoric, you could say. And he says anyone who's trying to interpret the Quran without having a strong foundation in these, in these linguistic disciplines should not be even interpreting the Quran at all. So I hope this is helpful. Sorry, I was a bit long-winded. And sorry, just to answer your one question you asked, which is why them, right? I think they each are representing a different ideological orientation. So you have Islamic modernism, who Rashid Rida, though, the disciple of Muhammad Abdo, I think represents more of like Reform Salafism than Islamic modernism as much. And then you have Sayyid Qutb, who becomes an Islamist, and then Muhammad al-Tahrīr ibn Ashur is difficult to label, but I do see him as a neo-traditionalist. And so they each have, because of their orientation, they each have their own way of engaging with the Islamic tradition. And this engagement with the Islamic tradition also influences the way they engage with the Qur'an and interpret the Qur'an, and what approaches they use to interpret the Qur'an. And so therefore, I thought it would be a really interesting case example to just sort of compare, right? To have these different, if you will, ideological orientations and methodological approaches, and kind of compare, like, okay, how do they differ? How are they similar?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Mubarak, for answering that so comprehensively.
We value your feedback and suggestions and would love to hear from you. If you have any thoughts, questions, or suggestions for future episodes, feel free to write to us at ergostudios.in@gmail.com. We read every message and take your input seriously. Your ideas help us improve and grow, so don't hesitate to reach out.
So, Dr. Mubarak, you have presented a very enriching discussion of 4 Quranic verses in your book, 4 controversial verses, that is, but due to lack of time, we can't go into all of them, but I would just like you to talk a little about verse 434 and verse 43, and tell us a little about what new ways of thinking does your research open up with regard to these verses, and especially, with respect to the exegetical tradition and women in Islam. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so Bismillah. This has been a verse 434 that has really, I guess we can say, led not only to a lot of debate, but a lot of hermeneutic tension, conscientious wrestling. Some scholars have described it in that way. I believe Dr. Aisha Chowdhury and others, have sort of, as well as Laurie Silvers, have sort of described it as a sort of wrestling, right, that happens within the conscience. And I think obviously there are a couple of reasons. One is this question of, does the Qur'an, which Muslims believe is divine discourse, give men some sort of level of authority or privilege over women, right? And that is one of the main questions that depending how you interpret this verse, that is one of the main questions it's really asking. And the second is, if it does give authority to men or husbands in particular, does it give husbands the authority to hit their wives, right? Like this idea of physical discipline. And for these reasons, right, this verse has created a lot of, one can say, controversy, this wrestling, because of and again, I think the one reason for this is because for a lot of Muslims, this just doesn't sit well with what we would consider Islamic ethics and what we would consider the broader paradigm of the Qur'an, right? Which is really about human accountability, right? And if we're to kind of call the main themes of the Qur'an, one of them is this notion of return to God, this notion that, there's a purpose to human existence, that humans ultimately return to God, something that Muslims share with Christians, right? This idea of the afterlife, and this idea of human accountability, right? And so for a lot of contemporary Muslims, you can say the notion that a husband could get away with physically disciplining his wife seems to in many ways be a dissonance or jarring, and doesn't align with what we consider the ethos of the Qur'an, the broader ethos of the Qur'an. And so what do the exegetes say about this question? First of all, there's a plurality of interpretation. And just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into qiwama as much. I mean, the other key word that's debated is this idea that men are qawamun over women. And what does that actually mean? Even in, by the way, pre-modern tafsir exegesis, you find a spectrum of interpretation. So for example, one of the earliest exegetes, al-Tabari, who died in 310 of the Hijri period, 923 Common Era, he understands qiwama as being really sort of bridled or restricted by legal rights. So Qiwama is not this authority that men have to ask their wives to obey them. That's not how he defines it. He sees it as an exchange of legal rights. And so men have some authority. It's limited, right? And they have some sort of authority. That's how he understands Qiwama, because of certain legal rights he is providing to his wife, paying the dower, providing financial maintenance, fulfilling women's essential needs. And he says for this reason, men became protectors over them. And then, this is what's really interesting. He says, commanding their wives in matters that God has relegated to the husbands. So in this, it's not just unrestricted, right? And basically here he's talking about a husband's right to sexual access to his wife. Right. And it's interesting because then accordingly, a woman who is guilty of nushuz is one who is refusing to sleep with her husband when he wants to sleep with her. Right. So it's very, very limited. But if you follow this phrase and the way it's interpreted throughout the centuries, you see this gradual expansion of what exegetes believe Qiwama means and entails, ultimately all the way up to the 14th century with Ibn Kathir, right? Who basically introduces this hadith, which again is a ahad hadith. It's a solitary hadith, this idea that he brings in this hadith, a prophetic tradition that a people ruled by a woman will never succeed, right? And it's a solitary hadith. So even according to the juristic principles, you couldn't really derive a legal ruling based on a hadith like this. Nonetheless, now Qiwama is no longer about like men exerting their right to sexual access to their wives, but it's really about husband's authority to lead, discipline, and preside over his wife. And he introduces this idea that men are ontologically superior to women, right? Which, interestingly, I had not seen the previous, especially early exegetes, mention this at all. And it almost becomes, and by the way, Karen Bauer's book, Gender Hierarchy in the Qur'an, talks about this important point. One reason for the gradual expansion, right, of how these phrases are understood is because exegetes are now asking the question, why, right? Why have men been given qiwama? Why have men been given a degree above women? And by the way, trying to answer this question, why, is very subjective, because unless the verse explicitly says why, now you're projecting your own socio-cultural norms upon the Quran, right? So this is what happens in a lot of the Tafsīr, where they're trying to ask this question, why? So the point is, by the time you get to Ibn Kathir in the pre-modern period, there's this like really broad understanding of qiwama being some broad authority, right? This broad authority that God is giving men over women, which is really not the way the earlier exegetes were looking at it. People like those like al-Tabari and even close to that period. So the modern exegetes, interestingly, they don't mention this notion of obedience, that the wife should obey the husband when they talk about qiwama, but they do mention that it is this leadership, that, every household needs a leader. And basically qiwama means that the man is the leader of the household. But you do have scholars like Muhammad Abdo go out of his way to say that's not to say that she should not be consulted, or she doesn't have her own opinions, or that she should even just follow him blindly, right? And I think that's really interesting, because even today in the 21st century, you have these really intense debates happening today among Muslims about the extent of men's rights over women and women's rights over men. And I'm always just so amazed, right, by like how carried away people can get with these debates and arguments. But finally, I want to just get to this question of, does the Quran give men the right to hit their wives? I think this is a really important question. So I want to first start with noting the most traditional position, because I think even there's a lot of misunderstanding. And the most traditional interpretation was that it was very, very restrictive, right? And here we're talking about, the dominant interpretation, really. We're talking about the dominant interpretation was that this is very, very restrictive and under very specific circumstances, which is the circumstance of nushuz. Okay, then there's this question of, well, what does nushuz even mean? Well, I'm not going to go into that right now, but there is some debate as to what exactly is nushuz. And you also had a scholar like Muhammad al-Tahrīr ibn Ashur, who actually saw nushuz as a very serious matter that required judicial intervention. That this is not something that you would take this matter to a court to adjudicate, and they would determine whether or not the wife was really guilty of nushuz, right? So that's one thing. Even among the dominant medieval position, it was, okay, well, first the wife had to be committing nushuz. Second of all, procedurally, the husband was required to follow the 3 disciplinary steps, and not simultaneously, but in a certain order. So first he had to, speak to her gently, tell her this is not right, whatever it is that she's doing, right? And usually this idea was that she was refusing to have sex with her husband, and that this was a right granted to him by the marriage contract. So she was reneging on a legal right her husband had, right? This is the most kind of common interpretation of nushuz, right? And I think that's important to bear in mind, because it's not just this idea of like, oh, she's disobeying him. So the more traditional interpretation was that, first if she was committing nushuz, he advises her, it doesn't work, then he moves on to the second step, which is he basically, leaves her to, stay in her, in a separate room or separate bed for a certain period of time. And if she still is not willing to, go back on her ways, then the last resort, and interestingly, they all, based on a prophetic tradition, say ضرب غير مبرح, that he is not allowed to inflict any physical pain or marks. So what kind of hitting is this? They say it's a symbolic hitting, like you take a handkerchief or miswak, toothbrush, and it's symbolic, right? You just kind of tap her with it. So I want to first start with a more conservative position, just to underscore that even among the most traditional interpretations, I did not find any exegete saying that this is a license for domestic violence. I think that's really, really important to bear in mind. Does domestic violence happen in Muslim communities? Sadly, yes. And it happens in all communities in the world. And when domestic violence happens, we need to blame the person, not the text, because the text is not the one that has agency. It's a human that has agency for their behavior and is making choices. And that is why I think when it comes to Islam, there tends to be this bias where we want to, absolve the person and blame the religious teachings. I think that's absolutely unfair to do, because we can then go to any religious tradition and argue that this religious teaching lends itself to X, Y, or Z. But then we're absolving the human being of responsibility. And that's not helpful, I think, to human societies in general. So we have to separate text from human behavior. That's one. But what I do want to say is, even in the medieval period, there were pre-modern exegetes who believed that a man should never hit his wife. Right, from starting from the second Islamic century, with the Meccan Mufti Ata ibn Abi Rabah, who died in 115 in the Hijri calendar and 733 in the Gregorian calendar. And he argued that his contemporaries had misunderstood this verse. And he said the husband does not hit his wife, but gets angry with her. And he said this imperative here, وَضْرِبُوهُنَّ, right, this imperative form, and hit them, did not function in this case as an obligation or even as a recommendation, but rather it functioned as a karahiyya, something that's disliked. So how could he arrive to this conclusion? So I think it's important to bear in mind an argument that Asma Barlas makes in her book, and I think it's a compelling argument. We need to realize that Muslim men, before the revelation of this verse, did not need license to hit their wives. We, in fact, have reports from Tafsīr, from Sirah, from elsewhere, that there were men who hit their wives. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, frowned upon it. And he said in many traditions, that certainly these are not the best of you, as well as many other traditions reprimanding men who hit their wives. So all of these serve as textual evidence that there was some form of domestic violence, we can say, happening in this period. And so we need to recognize that men did not need a license. And here in this verse, what was happening is saying that, hitting is no longer a first resort option. nor is it even a last resort option in the way that you were doing it. It's now something that's very, very restrictive, and it's this darb ghayr mubarrih, right? So this is, again, the dominant interpretation. But nonetheless, because of these hadith that the Prophet had given, right, a lot of reliable, authentic traditions, that he says, for example, the best of you shall not hit his wife. And he also says that this is وَلَنْ يَضْرِبْ خِيَارُكُمْ لَنْ يَضْرِبَ خِيَارُكُمْ. And then also his wife, Aisha, had talked about the fact that the Prophet, peace be upon him, never hit anyone, not even a child, not any of his wives, nothing, unless he was on the battlefield, right? Like literally on the battlefield fighting in war. And so because of these very strong traditions, you had later medieval exegetes and early jurists who argued that really, despite how this verse is being predominantly interpreted, one is preferable for one to never hit his wife, even if she's, nashiza, committing nushuz, even if all these other disciplinary measures fail. One of them was none other than Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, who died 204 in the Hijri calendar, 820 in the Gregorian calendar. And in his legal treatise, Kitab al-Umm, he basically says, we prefer, first of all, he says, وَضْرِبُهُنَّ is not an obligation. This is only a permissibility, right? So it's, again, like Asma Barlas is saying, it's changing the whole context through which, or the entire lens through which this physical discipline was understood, right? It's now applying a lot of restrictions. And that basically saying, again, based on the very traditional or dominant interpretation that it's only under these circumstances, only now under these circumstances, men no longer have this free license to hit their wives as they did before Islam. But nonetheless, like Ash-Shafi'i, he says, we opine that a man not hit his wife due to her loose tongue towards him or what resembles this, right? And he says, we prefer for him what the Prophet, peace be upon him, preferred. He writes, Kisha Ali writes, it is fair to assume that Shafi'i shares the prophetic distaste for striking wives. The refrain, the best of you will not strike, is repeated 3 times in one section alone. So these legal opinions offered by Ata ibn Abi Rabah and Ash-Shafi'i become critical points of intervention in the Quranic commentaries of this verse, of verse 434. And then you have 2 medieval jurists. One was Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, and then the second is Fakhruddin al-Razi, both using these different opinions to argue that, again, it is men really should not hit their wives, even in these circumstances of nushuz, and that this was an accurate reflection or understanding of divine law, because they believed that the Qur'an needed to be measured against the behavior of the Prophet and the understanding of the Prophet. And if the Qur'an was obliging the Prophet to hit or strike his wives, then he would have been the first to implement it. And yet he never did. And yes, his wives sometimes, rebelled against certain aspects, right, of their marital life. We know it because the Quran refers to it in Surah Al-Ahzab and other places of the Quran, right? And we know, obviously, chapter 24, Surah An-Nur, there's this incident of an ifk, this place or time period in which there was speculation about the moral probity of Aisha, and yet the Prophet never resorted, right, to any of this. So these are really important arguments that are also made in the modern period. But my main argument, I'm sorry, I've been very long-winded here, is that this idea of saying no to a straightforward literal interpretation of this verse is not just a modern stance. That we actually can find this in the pre-modern period, where you have Fakhruddin al-Razi, where you have Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, who was an Andalusian exegete, who Ibn al-Arabi dies 1148, right? So 12th century, who also say no to a straightforward literal interpretation of this verse. And then in the 21st century, you have Muhammad al-Tahrīr ibn Ashur, of all the 4 modern exegetes I look at, who also says that based on, again, Ata's opinion that, this verse was misunderstood by his contemporaries, that really a husband should not be allowed to hit his wife under any circumstances. And it's really interesting, I think, the way Ibn Ashur arrives at this conclusion, because he says that if we are to allow a husband while he's to adjudicate for himself, right? So this wife is guilty of nushuz, and now he's adjudicating for himself and venting his anger. He said, like, and this is where his, experience as a mufti and as a judge really comes through. And he says it's most likely that this man will transgress. He will exceed the limits, and we should not therefore put him in or allow him to do this in the first place. And that this is why, interestingly, he is one of the really actually the only exegete I found among all the pre-modern and modern exegetes I've explored who argues that perhaps this verse is actually not addressing the husbands when it says وَضْرِبُوهُنَّ, because earlier in the verse it says وَاللَّاتِي تَخَافُونَ نُشُوزَهُنَّ, and those whose nushuz you fear. So who's this you here? Who is being addressed? And based on this philological precedent by Az-Zamakhshari, he says this you actually could be the legal authorities. And there is philological precedent that the Qur'an in a singular passage might refer one group of people and then shift to referring to addressing another group of people. And he brings examples of this. And so therefore, based on this precedent, he says that verse 434 might be addressing the legal authorities when it says those whose nushuz you fear, which means that the legal authorities need to become involved in this marital dispute. And this is where he says, since cases of nushuz would be taken up to the courts for judges to resolve based on the husband's complaints. And so with this subtle stroke, he really underscores the need for intervention by legal authorities who would determine, first of all, whether or not nushuz had occurred, but who also would protect the woman from potential abuse that could happen from a misunderstanding of this verse. And this is what he writes. He writes, hitting is a dangerous matter. A limit must be applied in this matter, which jurisprudence clarifies, because if the husbands are allowed to administer this, and while they are venting their anger, then it is expected that they will transgress the limits, for it is rare that one punishes commensurate to the sin. Further, the basis of jurisprudential principles does not permit for one to adjudicate for himself, and يقضي أحدا لنفسه, or أن يقضي أحد لنفسه, unless there is a necessity, a darura. And so again, like Ata ibn Abi Rabah, he says that one should not hit his wife, preferably. And also the second opinion, which is more of a linguistic one, is that if the legal authorities would be the ones to apply the various steps in order, if we are to take this interpretation, that they are being addressed, not the husbands. Except, he said, with the exception of hajr, the second of the third disciplinary steps, because obviously only the husband could refrain from sleeping with his wife, right? Anyway, I know this is long-winded. I think the really important point I want to, hone in for your listeners is just to understand the pluralism of this genre of Quranic exegesis, and the fact that it's, again, happening within a specific context. Each writer is writing his commentary within a specific historical context or certain debates that are happening, and to have a better insight into what this person is responding to, we really need to kind of situate their commentary within that context. So thank you so much.
Are you a creative, curious individual with a passion for history, media, society, and culture of South Asia? Do you want to be a part of a vibrant global community of thinkers and creators? If so, we would love to have you on our team. We're always looking for talented individuals to help us create compelling content and grow our platform. Check out our current openings on our website www.ergostudios.net/join-us, and join us in our mission to enrich public discourse.
Thank you so much for explaining this in such a detailed manner, and I hope our listeners would also benefit from this. So I think we'll now come to an end of this discussion. But before we go, do you have any book recommendations for our listeners in the field of Islam and gender studies?
Let me think. Book recommendations. Yes, I think definitely. Sorry, did you say Quranic studies specifically, or?
Yeah, anything related to Islam and women, like the relationship between the two, gender studies, Islamic studies, and so on.
Yeah, I really like the book by for the Quran, Women and Gender in the Quran by Celine Ibrahim, Abla Hassan, also decoding the gender egalitarianism of the Quran. There's a new book called Islamic Interpretive Tradition and Gender Justice by Naveen Rida and edited by Naveen Rida and Yasmin Amin. I would recommend that book. I also would recommend a new this book engages the fiqh rather than the tafsir. It's called Wives and Work by Marilyn Katz. I think it's a really interesting book that also showcases the pluralism of the medieval legal tradition on whether or not wives owed any housework or not. And it's actually, I think the findings would be very surprising for a lot of people. That wives did not owe housework to their husbands, at least in the early period of Islam. So Wives and Work, I would recommend. I think there's one other book I'm forgetting right now. Obviously, these books are not as new, but Karen Bauer's book on gender hierarchy in the Quran, as well as Johanna Pink's Modern Quranic Interpretation Today, I would recommend.
Okay, so would you like to share with us what your next project is? Is there something that you're currently working on?
Yeah, so the next project I hope to work on, God willing, is going to be a book on biblical women in the Quran. And I would really like to sort of highlight the way the Quran represents a retelling of certain narratives that are familiar to the biblical readers or certain narratives from the Bible, right? And we share this important, historical narrative with both Jews and Christians as to some of these female figures that existed throughout human history. And I really want to do a close linguistic analysis as well as engaging with the Tafsīr on these women, because there's a lot of really, really interesting, rich findings that I think have yet to be sort of highlighted.
That sounds really interesting. So thank you so much, Dr. Mubarak, for joining in today. This was a very enriching conversation, and I hope our listeners would enjoy it as well and benefit from it. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Sania, and good luck with your master's degree. I'm really excited for you and hope to keep in touch and see all the great things you'll be doing.
Before we go, we wanted to let you know about some of the other exciting projects that Ergo Collective brings for you. If you enjoy thought-provoking discussions, check out our monthly discussion forums where we dwell into a wide range of topics related to South Asian culture and society. Find us at ergostudios.net/majlis, that's MAJLIS, and ergostudios.net/Manār, MINAR. And if you want to stay up to date with all things Ergo Collective, be sure to subscribe to our monthly Substack newsletter, Khat. Just head over to our website or check the podcast description to know more and sign up. It's just that easy. Thank you for tuning in into another episode of Dariyaa podcast. We hope you found our discussion thought-provoking. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your support means the world to us and helps us reach more listeners like you. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep challenging the status quo.